Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I haven't done a midweek message recently. Um, I just wasn't feeling it. I just wasn't. I'm not going to force something. But I want to share a bit about, I think, one of the holiest things that we can offer in our lifetime, okay? There are nights in disaster shelters, and I've been thinking about this with, you know, going into the season where tornadoes will be more and more evasive and invasive in our nation. There are nights in disaster shelters when exhaustion becomes almost physical in the air. I've been told that you can feel it in those shelters, hanging over the cots of rows of cots in the folding chairs long after midnight. Volunteers moving about slowly, children finally falling asleep, coffee growing cold in the paper cups, people staring silently at their phones for any updates that may never come. And sometimes in those quiet hours, someone asks a question that no training manual can fully answer. Why did God let this happen? I've heard many versions of that question in my ministry. Sometimes it's spoken directly. Yeah. More often, it hides beneath other words, words that are saying, I did everything right. We prayed all night. She was a good person. I don't understand. Most people assume that the deepest wounds after catastrophe are emotional. Certainly, many are. Trauma affects the mind and the body in profound ways. Fear, grief, anxiety, and exhaustion are quite real. They deserve careful attention and compassionate care. But some wounds reach deeper than emotion. Some wounds disrupt meaning itself. I've come to believe many survivors, caregivers, and responders carry injuries that are not merely psychological. They are spiritual. Not spiritual in the shallow sense of religious cliches or inspirational language. Spiritual in the deeper sense. Wounds connected to meaning, conscience, trust, identity, and hope. These wounds, they often emerge when a person's understanding of the world collapses under the weight of their lived experience. For example, a father prays desperately for his child to survive, and the child dies anyway. A pastor spends years caring for others while quietly falling apart inside. A nurse must choose which patient receives limited resources. A disaster responder walks through neighborhoods where entire lives have been erased in a single afternoon. An exhausted volunteer realizes they no longer feel what they used to feel. None of these experiences fit neatly into the language of burnout alone. Burnout affects energy, okay? Uh, Spiritual injury affects meaning. That distinction matters. For years, caregiving cultures have become increasingly comfortable discussing stress, fatigue, and mental health. That is good and necessary progress. But many caregivers still struggle to speak honestly about moral pain, spiritual exhaustion, and wounded faith. In some environments, Acknowledging spiritual struggle still feels a little dangerous. Caregivers often believe they are supposed to remain emotionally steady, right? Spiritually confident and endlessly resilient. Clergy, especially, can feel pressure to continue offering certainty long after certainty itself has begun to crack. Disaster work as a way of dismantling simplistic explanations. Early in ministry, I think for many of us, we quietly assume faith will eventually produce the answers. We may not say this out loud, okay, but underneath our theology often rests an expectation that suffering should somehow make sense. If we think hard enough, if we pray deeply enough, or trust faithfully enough. And then catastrophe arrives. And catastrophe is rarely interested in our explanations. Floodwaters do not pause for theology. Cancer does not politely cooperate with sermons. Tornadoes do not distinguish between the righteous and the unrighteous. Mass shootings do not ignore sanctuaries. Eventually, many caregivers discover something quite unsettling. People suffering catastrophic loss usually do not need explanations nearly as much as they need presence. In fact, explanations offered too quickly can actually deepen the wound. I remember sitting beside a gentleman in Nashville whose home had been destroyed in a fire. And everything familiar to him was suddenly gone. And I remember volunteers around him tried desperately to encourage him, saying words like, "At least you survived," or "God has a plan," or "things could be worse." Now, none of those statements were cruel. They were really attempts at comfort, but each one unintentionally moved away from the actual pain that was sitting in front of us in that man. Finally, the man looked down at the floor and quietly said, "I just need somebody to sit here for a minute." That may be one of the holiest sentences I've ever heard, because underneath it was a truth. Many caregivers spend years learning. Presence is sometimes more healing than explanation. The ministry of presence sounds simple until you attempt it, honestly. Remaining emotionally present beside suffering without immediately trying to solve it requires enormous spiritual discipline. And most of us instinctively move towards fixing, reassuring, or controlling because helplessness just makes us uncomfortable. Silence exposes us, folks. So does grief. So does unanswered prayer. Yet the Bible itself contains far more emotional honesty than many religious communities allow. The Psalms repeatedly give voice to confusion and anger and abandonment and lament. "How long, O Lord? How long? My God, why have you forsaken me?" Those statements are not failures of faith. They are expressions of faith, wounded, but still speaking. I sometimes worry modern religious culture has become uncomfortable with honest lament. We often rush people quickly towards resolution. We want Easter morning, right? Without lingering at the tomb. We prefer certainty over ambiguity because, well, certainty feels safer. Ministry through the years has taught me something different. Human beings do not heal because someone explains away their suffering. They heal because they discover they are not abandoned inside it. That applies not only to survivors, but also to the caregivers themselves. Many responders quietly carry memories that they cannot easily release. Faces remain with them. Conversations linger. Certain scenes return unexpectedly years later. Some experience guilt over decisions made under impossible circumstances. Others feel haunted by helplessness, by all that they could not prevent, could not fix, or could not save. Often these wounds, they remain hidden because caregiving cultures reward strength more than honesty. But unspoken wounds rarely disappear. They simply go underground. This is one reason spiritual care for caregivers matters so deeply. Responders and clergy need places where they can speak truthfully about exhaustion, grief, doubt, numbness, and moral pain without being treated as if somehow they are weak or faithless. Sometimes the most important spiritual moment is not finding an answer. Sometimes it's just finally telling the truth. The truth that you are tired. The truth that something inside you hurts. The truth that prayer feels different these days. The truth that an illness or catastrophe has changed you. And perhaps also the truth that faith itself may survive not as certainty, but as the willingness to remain present with God, with others, and with ourselves, even when explanations fail. Folks, after years of serving others, I no longer believe that the deepest form of spiritual care is providing answers. I believe it is helping people remain human, to listen without rushing, to sit without fleeing, to grieve without shame, to lament honestly, to stay present when suffering resists explanation. Because sometimes, dear friends, the holiest thing we can offer someone is not certainty. Sometimes it's simply the quiet assurance that they do not suffer alone. God bless you. Peace be with you. Love you.